It's early January and hype is rising for a new Monster Hunter game, but this isn't 2021 or whatever year you're watching this in. We're back in 2018. Look up the sales figures for the Monster Hunter series and one game rules supreme at the top of the rankings, Monster Hunter Portable Third. It came out in the last month of 2010 and the website tells you it sits at 4.9 million copies sold. This number's pretty impressive, but what makes it even more so is that these sales are only from Japan. Multiple entries had come out since the release of Portable Third, but not even the ones that got worldwide releases had been able to knock it from its pedestal. In Japan, the series had become a cultural phenomenon. Everywhere you looked, there was Monster Hunter. If you wanted to launch a game in Japan, you'd better check when the new Monster Hunter was launching. Release too close to that and you'd have no chance of dragging people's attention away towards your game. Contrast that to the Western markets, where fans were unsure if they'd even get each new installment localized. Portable Third sticks out as a particularly sore example. A great game they'd never get the chance to play unless they imported it and struggled through the menu-heavy game in a language they didn't understand. What happened more often was that the games would release a few months or even years after their initial Japanese one. The fanbase grew over the years, but it never got to the point that you wouldn't classify it as niche. Fans dreamed of a day where they could ask a friend, "Hey, have you seen the new Monster Hunter?" and not just get back a confused look. But this first week of 2018 is exciting, because at the end of the month comes the next installment, Monster Hunter World. The game looks like an evolution in so many ways, and on top of that, for the first time ever a Monster Hunter game was being simultaneously released in all markets worldwide. Underneath it all was a thought that always ran through the minds of longtime fans in the lead up to a new release. Would this be the game that broke through and made the series big in the West? Was the worldwide simultaneous release evidence that Capcom themselves believed this would be the one to do it? Only time would tell. Let's jump back to the present. As of September 2020, Monster Hunter World has sold 16.4 million copies worldwide, more than tripling the sales of Monster Hunter Portable Third to become the new best-selling Monster Hunter game. That wasn't the only Capcom game to be dethroned. World currently stands as the best-selling Capcom game of all time, overtaking every entry in the Resident Evil, Street Fighter and Devil May Cry series. What's more, 70% of those sales came from outside of Japan. Back in 2015, Capcom was celebrating the fact that Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate sold over 1 million copies in Europe and North America. 70% of world sales puts that figure at around 11.5 million. World had managed to take Monster Hunter worldwide. So what changed? How did a series that was 14 years old suddenly change its luck and break through to become mainstream in more than just its home country? Who thought it was a good idea to sign off on this? This video seeks to answer the first two questions, and to do that we'll first take a look at how the series developed over the years. The first Monster Hunter game was released back in 2004 and came as a result of Capcom's drive to develop a game that took advantage of the PS2's online capabilities. The core premise was simple: take on quests to hunt monsters, then make new and improved equipment from their parts once the job was done. The game was received fairly well, with the main criticisms being the high learning curve and the clunky control scheme. This issue of the learning curve was something every subsequent game struggled to address adequately, and it's something we can point at immediately as a contributor to why the game struggled to catch on in the West. But if that's an intrinsic problem of the game, then surely the Japanese audience would have faced the exact same problem. To understand how they overcame that, we need to look at one part of the first game that did receive critical acclaim: the fact that it was very fun to play with other people. Considering the title was developed with an online focus in mind, this might not sound too surprising. Instead, what might be surprising is that the series really gained popularity when it moved from the PS2 to the PlayStation Portable, with entries that ditched internet-facilitated multiplayer in favour of the close proximity ad hoc variety. This is the first step in understanding why the series took off in Japan while at the same time languishing in the West. To see why, let's look at the total number of PSPs sold in both Japan and the United States. In 2010, we see that there were 1 million more PSPs sold in Japan than there were in the West. So the PSP was more successful in Japan, but not by that much. Now let's look at the sales for the Xbox 360 and the PS3. In Japan, the PS3 fared a lot better than the Xbox, but still, if we take these figures into account with that of the PSP sales, we can see that handheld gaming was a lot more popular in Japan than it was in the West. This comes down to cultural differences between the two. For one, Japan still has a very strong arcade culture, meaning that at its core, gaming isn't something that's thought of as being done exclusively in your own home. If you live in a city, then that home is likely to be a lot smaller than what you'd have if you lived in the West. If there's only a single living space, then when multiple people live under the same roof, a smaller gaming device might look appealing, because you don't have to completely take over the living space and TV whenever you want to play. Public transport is extensive and of a high quality too, so something to keep you occupied while on those many journeys could alleviate a lot of boredom. Keep in mind the PSP was released 2 years before the release of the first iPhone and the subsequent rise of smartphones. In contrast to this, the culture of gaming in the West is much more confined to the home. After experiencing a golden age in the 80s, arcade culture saw a steep decline. The larger living spaces means that you don't have to share space as much, and in 2008 it was estimated that between 50 and 70% of American kids had TVs in their bedroom. This preference in the preferred platform of gaming can already start to explain why Monster Hunter saw success in Japan and not in the West. After all, if you release a game on an unsuccessful platform, then that game is also likely to be unsuccessful. But this isn't the full picture. Even though home consoles were getting more attention in the West, there was still a decent number of people with PSPs. But there's something about the series that exacerbates this problem, and that's the big focus the game has on cooperative play. In an article exploring the success of the series in Japan, Toshi Nakamura found that everybody he spoke to had been introduced to the series by somebody else, and it's this social aspect that is a huge factor in the success of the series. This was partly due to the way in which the game was designed, of course, but it's also thanks to what was going on outside of the game. Shared social experiences are a great way of starting and fostering friendships, and having to meet up in person to play means there's inevitably things going on with the people you're playing with both before and after the actual hunting, which can add another social layer to playing the game. Having to meet up in person to play like this wasn't a problem for the Japanese thanks to their preference for handheld gaming. People live a lot closer together too, almost 10 times so in fact, which makes this process easier. When you're more spread out, as is the case in the West, it's a lot easier to just play with friends online. Without the option to play Monster Hunter online, this meant that for a lot of people they were missing out on a big part of the experience. This social aspect probably helped solve the problem of the high learning curve too. After all, you're much more likely to try something new if it's with friends. I hate heights, but I've been climbing multiple times because a friend of mine was into it, and it was just fun to do it with him. This was a problem that people in Capcom were aware of too. COO of Capcom Europe, Stuart Turner, talked about how for years they've been trying to tell the Japanese team that the series could see success in the West if it was released on the right platform and if it embraced online play. So from all this, we can say that the series struggled in the West because of the high learning curve and the lack of the social aspect being fully experienced. In Japan, it saw success mostly because gamers there got to experience the full multiplayer side of the series. They still had the high learning curve to contend with, but the social interactions likely helped alleviate that a lot by providing incentive for new players to stick with it, because after all, that's what the people around you were doing. If a Monster Hunter game is going to see success in the West, it was going to have to address those two issues. In 2004, Yuya Tokuda saw the trailer for the first Monster Hunter game. He was impressed, so impressed in fact that he joined Capcom to work on the series. For 10 years he contributed to the game's design, and had a hand in creating some fan favourite monsters. At the end of those 10 years, in 2014, he was given the chance to be director of the next main instalment. To go from being a fan of the series to being the director is a hell of a success story, and it gave him the chance to explore the feelings that original trailer elicited from him and incorporate them into his directorial vision. One thing that impressed him the most was that the monsters weren't just enemies, and instead they were one part of a larger ecosystem. If you watch the trailer, you can see where he's coming from. You can see monsters going about their own business and a little bit of the predator-prey relationships that are central to ecosystems. When you played the game though, this feeling wasn't really replicated, and part of this comes down to how the areas of the game are structured. Each location is divided up into smaller zones, with a quick loading screen separating them from each other. This was done to save on memory, which especially helped on the handheld releases. The side effect though was that it made every zone feel disconnected from all the others. When they had nothing but you and a monster in them, they could feel very much like an arena that the two of you were dueling in, as opposed to an actual living environment. Compare this reality with what the trailer showed, and the world of Monster Hunter seemed somewhat lifeless by comparison. But now, Yuya Tokuda had the chance to change that. He decided the mission of the next installment would be to create a living, breathing world for the player to explore and experience. The first step to realising this vision was to get rid of the isolated, zoned approach to areas. This would stick around in the underlying design, but there will be no loading screens to make travel between each zone seamless and more natural. He also needed to reimagine what the series placed into those zones. After all, to create the feeling of a living, breathing world, you need to fill it with living, breathing things, and preferably lots of things. Ecosystems are incredibly complicated things filled with links from the smallest creature to the largest, so attention was paid not just to the big monsters that attack you, but to the smaller ones that run away from you. But that's not to say that the main event monsters wouldn't need some upgrades. The team realised complex AI would be needed to have them exist and behave in these new environments in realistic and interesting ways. All of these things could be achieved with one big change. The series would need to take advantage of the advanced hardware of home consoles like the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Of course, to do that, the game would have to fully embrace online multiplayer. Some later entries in the series did have online multiplayer as a feature, but the design was still catered towards in-person play. For example, it was still organised by rooms containing 4 players maximum. Now that online play was the only option, changes were made to improve the experience. Players are still grouped together, but the player count was up to 16, and the SOS system was added so that you could play with people outside of your own group. This meant that players in the West were finally able to experience this social aspect of the game to its full extent for the first time, solving one of the big obstacles the series faced if it needed to go mainstream. But that's not all. This driving mission also had a big effect on the gameplay. As an example of this, let's take a look at the healing system. In past games you'd heal by drinking a potion, and while you did that you'd stand completely still. Flexing was cool, but doing this during combat could be risky. One thing you could do to alleviate this though was leave the zone the monster was in, heal in peace, and then head straight back in. Veteran players might scoff at such a strategy, but it could be beneficial for new players who hadn't gotten to grips with everything yet. With no loading screens between zones, this strategy would be impossible, and so to compensate, the mechanic was changed so that you can heal while moving. There were many small changes and tweaks like this, because the goal of creating a living environment set off a domino effect that rippled through every aspect of gameplay. The end result was something that was definitely a Monster Hunter game, but one that was still distinctly new when compared to past entries. And what better opportunity to capture new fans who may have been reluctant to try in the past. As a result, more effort was put into tutorials and early sections to help new players adopt the game. What was previously all done by text boxes that could be lost within the many menus was now fully voiced and put front and centre. More feedback was added to help understanding of all the mechanics. For example, the attacks now showed damage numbers. Ahead of release, some fans feared that they were making the game too easy to attract new players, to which the team reiterated that most of the gameplay changes came as a result of their core driving mission. So there we have it. Monster Hunter World managed to address the two main problems that had previously held the series back in the West, and it did so by putting the mission to create a living, breathing world as the core principle of its entire design. And with those two issues addressed, the game saw unprecedented success, propelling it into the mainstream of Western gaming culture. Of course, the quality of the game has a big part in this too. World has received critical acclaim, to the point that it was nominated for various Game of the Year awards. Looking back at that original trailer, I think it's fantastic how far the series has come, and it's great that so many new people are experiencing and enjoying the franchise. It's interesting that the next installment, Monster Hunter Rise, is being released for the Nintendo Switch, which bridges the gap between home and handheld gaming. It'll be a while yet before we know how it fares in the West, but for the moment one thing is clear, Monster Hunter has definitely gone worldwide, and given the hype Rise has behind it, I don't think it's going away anytime soon.